Hello, folks. This is going to be taking a look at conditional statements. It's a special coding technique for programming languages called if statements. Sometimes they're called conditional statements. And we're going to take a look at that today. We're introducing this. This is probably the most important type of statement in all of programming of any language, any programming situation, any piece of software that gets written. This is probably the most important structure to understand how this works. It's pretty simple, but it has a lot of ramifications and a lot of variants that can go on in it. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this today and what we're talking about. Any language. We're using JavaScript, and I'm going to share the screen and explain based on our little scenario that we've got going for what we're working on here. Okay, we are doing a Monopoly. We're coding a sort of a virtual Monopoly game for a web page. We're going to be dealing with a lot of properties later, and so we want to be able to see these properties and see items and information about these properties that are pertinent to maybe a player's situation in a game. Okay, so we've got a couple of files here, about 2 or 3 files that we're using to show this. I'm using Replit, and I'm going to take a look at this the way we've got it. Now, we're going to look first at the way we've sort of been doing things, and then we'll, I guess, kind of convert this to maybe a different, and sometimes, a lot of times, it's a better way of doing things. We'll take a look at that in just a second. First of all, this is the way that we have been doing things with using multiple different function calls and functions for each button or for each situation in which we need a program to do something. So we're going to be using buttons. It lends itself very much to events and interactivity. We want to be able to see something happen quickly in our web page, showing us whether or not we've done it correctly. So we've set up multiple buttons here for let's just say we've got these 3 properties, and we can do more after this, but I'm just going to use this example to explain these 3. These are the green properties, the dark green properties, North Carolina Avenue, Pacific Avenue, and Pennsylvania Avenue on one side of a typical traditional Monopoly board. Okay, each one of these has a button set up. We've set them up in the body of this web page right here. They're all 3 right here. We're using different, we're using input tags that are, the type is designated to be button, and they each call a separate function. The Carolina button calls a function called show North Carolina stuff. The Pacific button calls a function called show Pacific stuff, and the Pennsylvania Avenue button calls a function called show Pennsylvania stuff. Each of them does send a parameter. We've talked about parameters before, so we know a little bit about that. It's a piece of information passed through the parentheses in a function call, and they correspond to a variable that is in each definition of a function that we've created up here in our script section for the web page. Okay, so we've got 3 functions that correspond up here: show North Carolina stuff, show Pacific stuff, show Pennsylvania stuff. And we know, we've already talked about how these functions are defined to take a variable that is sending specific, detailed, literal information, but it's variabilized when it comes into as a parameter into each of these functions. Okay, we're not really using that right now. We could use it in our alert. I'm not gonna work with that right now. Just want to show you that each of these functions does something. It basically does the same thing, but with just different information. Okay, so we've got the North Carolina information, the Pacific Avenue information, the Pennsylvania information, and they work like this. And each button can be clicked, and it will trigger the running of a separate function to show that specific information for that specific property that each button corresponds to. Okay, so that's one way to organize this aspect of a program where you have multiple things to do, and they're all similar types of things, but they just contain maybe different particulars as far as within the realm of that similar type of thing that is being done. Okay, so I'm going to show you an alternative way to do this, and it may save some code, some lines of code. It may save just some thinking. It may save just the way the program, some lines and some complexity in the program. But we want to look at if statements because they're really important for getting things done. They will allow us to have a little more flexibility. In fact, potentially a lot more. But there's no saying necessarily that one way, whether we're using multiple functions or if statements necessarily is the only way to do it. We couldn't say that, but it is good to know how to do conditional statements. In fact, it's going to be pretty essential to get some things written this way. We're just using this as an example, a pretty basic example. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, this is a different way to write this. This is a whole different file. Okay, it's similar, but it is different. It has the main difference is it's only got one function in it. Okay, right, and it's right here. Actually, I'm missing a curly bracket there. Okay, so it's only got one function, and it only calls one function. Okay, each of the buttons call the same function. I'm going to run my index file again and get to the if statement version, the output for it. Now I capitalize these button names or these button values so that you know that it's a different file. It's the if statement version of this little project, okay, instead of the multiple function version of this little project. So on here, each of these buttons calls the same function: show property, show property, show property. Okay, they each send, of course, a different parameter: North Carolina, Pacific, Pennsylvania. Okay, now the difference here is in the script area. There's one function. It's a good bit larger. Okay, in fact, it has an if statement for each of the possibilities that these buttons represent. Okay, so this is the if statement right here, and the core thing of the if statement is this piece right here inside of the parentheses, and that is what we call a comparison statement or a comparison expression. And this particular one, we've got a double equal sign in here. That does not exactly mean, in fact, it doesn't mean what the single equal sign means. This means this is testing for equivalence. I'm using N, and I probably shouldn't use that. I probably should change this to prop on here. Okay, just like it was when we used the multiple functions version of this file. We'll call this incoming piece of data, this incoming parameter prop will be the variable name we'll give it. And so we'll change these to prop. N is a common variable used for number, okay, to represent a number. But in this case, we're going to use prop because we're sending it a property from the Monopoly game, okay? And if prop equals if prop is equivalent to North Carolina, the text North Carolina, then fire this or run this alert right here and pop up a box with this message in it about North Carolina. If prop is equivalent to Pacific, then use this alert and execute this line of code. If prop is equivalent to Pennsylvania, then use this line of code. Okay, so this is how we differentiate things based on an if statement or a conditional statement. This is always some kind of comparison operator here. If you were using numbers and you needed to match numbers or come within a range of numbers, you could use less than, greater than. less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. There are different comparison operators that you can use here when constructing your conditional statement. Okay. Another one might be the exclamation point with an equal sign, which means not equal. If prop is not equal to something, then execute some lines of code or a line of code. Okay. We can put as many lines of code in here as we want to, as long as they're enclosed between the curly brackets of the if statement, which is right there. Okay. Anything in there, if this is true right here, anything in between these curly brackets right here will get executed. Okay. That is how a conditional statement works. That's how if statements work. I'm going to show you this. This is a diagramming. This is kind of a chart that diagrams the if statement or the conditional statement. Okay. This has to come out to be either true or false. So this is what we call a Boolean value, either true or false. And we'll talk about that another time. But based on this is going to result in whether or not this line of code gets executed. Okay, so in this case, if the score is equivalent to 100, if the score variable has a number in it equivalent to 100, then you're going to execute this line of code, which outputs a piece of text to the message div that says game over. Okay. This is how the if statement works. It will only execute if this is true. Okay. So good thing to know. That's important. I want to make sure that we're real clear on that. Okay. So in this case, we are only executing one line of code in each if statement. We're going to keep it simple so it's easy to see what the important points of this are, and you can figure out what's going on, how this works, and be able to set this up for yourself a little bit. Okay. So the project, the assignment I'm asking you to do for this is I want a grand total of 8 of these if statements in here. Okay. I want you to do 8 properties. If you get really ambitious, you could do 10. That would be a whole side of Monopoly. Okay. On the board. This is going to mean that you've got to put in some more buttons. I need at least 5 more buttons here. Okay, to make the 8. And I need I'm going to need a corresponding additional set of if statements up here to match all of the possibilities for the buttons. The buttons will just move right across here. They'll line up, and then they'll wrap down below. Okay, in the display portion of this. So that's what I'm looking for. Okay, this is if statements, conditional statements. Make sure I covered everything. Got a true and a false. I think that's pretty much it. Okay, you do have a parameter coming in here. We're using that for the comparison. That's typical to be done. You've got an enclosing set of curly brackets here for the actual function itself. Okay, right here. And then each of the if statements has its own set of curly brackets that enclose each one of those. Okay, so each one is separate. You're not going to get some piece of code executing by accident. You want to make sure they're enclosed by curly brackets. I will say this on an if statement. I believe Java and JavaScript, if you only have one line of code to execute in an if statement, I don't think it makes you put the curly brackets in. I always put the curly brackets in because if I know how I am when I program, I'll go back in here and want to add a couple lines of code, make it do something else as well. And if I've forgotten to put the brackets in, it's only going to execute the first line. It won't execute the rest without the curly brackets. It'll think they belong to something else. Okay, it won't execute them based on the condition that I'm looking for inside the parentheses of the if statement. So I always put the curly brackets in. Okay, that way I'm never going to be without the enclosure there and the protection of keeping things only executing when their conditions are true. Okay, All right, so that's if statements. They're also known as conditional statements, probably the most important. Frankly, it's probably the most important technique in programming that we have. Okay, there are other things there are other large things, but this is fundamental. This is basic to every programming language, and much logic is based on this technique. Okay, we will have other ways to write this. We'll have some other techniques to use that essentially do the same thing. And they might be a little bit more efficient because this can get pretty long. You can have 100 if statements inside this one function, okay, and that's okay. You could have, you know, a lot of functions if you wanted to instead, but this is oftentimes considered more efficient and more self-contained, and it just gives us one place to go to kind of look at what's going on in a program concerning particular things that might have to do with these conditions. Okay, so that's wrapping up if statements. I will look forward to seeing your little files getting posted for this, and if there's any trouble, let me know. Thank you guys. Bye.